historically, particularly the boys, have underachieved.
Yeah.
So we did have a very large gap a few years ago in terms of our GCSE results. I've got all the data here. Last year was the first time ever that we've had boys outperforming girls in terms of progress 8 and attainment 8. So they actually outperformed the girls.
What we'd love to hear is, how do you know you've done better, close the gap or whatever, and what did you do?
Right. Well, the data last year was our first ever year where boys outperformed girls. And I'd like to say it was all down to my hard work in terms of leading that area for development. But yeah, in Middleton, what we've got in our school is a very white working class school. So we've got quite a large percentage of people in the bottom postcodes, difficult, challenging estates with high social deprivation, high crime rates, a lot of white working class, and they historically, particularly the boys, have underachieved. So we did have a very large gap a few years ago in terms of our GCSE results. I've got all the data here. I'm in charge of pupil premium gap here as a assistant head as well. So I was looking at basically
one thing. I think you're a secondary school, is that right?
That's correct. We are secondary, yes. Yeah. Sorry, yes. Secondary school. So I was in charge of, have been for a few years, the pupil premium gap. And also was doing my NPQH, National Professional Qualification for Head Teachers.
Right.
And part of that qualification, you have to do an in-school project, a big area for development for the school, whole school leading, whatever. And my focus for that was the boy to girl gap. That was my big task, if you like, as a school. Last year was the first time ever that we've had boys outperforming girls in terms of progress 8 and attainment 8. So they actually outperform the girls. All our data again this year shows the gap is reduced in most years, but girls are back to outperforming boys, but not by as bad as they were. So the data says we have had impact. Obviously, you also get that part of it is we've got a year group which is slightly skewed. We've got a year group where boys, for whatever reason, are a little bit better than historically. I wouldn't say it's all down to the interventions we put in place, but all my reading and all my research leading into the interventions we put in place were actually saying move away from focusing on boys, these boy groups, or the curriculum being more boy friendly, like making sure football's talked about in lessons and what text do we look at in English, let's make sure they're boy friendly text, or this sort of stuff. Move away from that doesn't help.
Can I just ask you, what were your main influences?
Young People on the Margins book, Boys Don't Cry, sorry, that book.
Okay.
A load of papers, and they all implied, my summary is that actually move away from focusing on the boys, but focus on high aspirations and high expectations for all. Rather than saying, right, you boys, you need to pull your fingers out. We need to sort our boys out. What we need to sort out is our attitude as staff towards the individual and our aspirations and expectations of every individual. So when they walk into a classroom, does a student feel that they're valued? So how are they welcomed on the door? Irrespective of whether a boy, girl, whatever, what does your classroom, the environment, say about your expectations, student? What do the posters say? Are they of high ability work, or are they just a mess? What does your desk say of you caring about those students? So all those sort of things. I put together a working party of middle leaders to that effect, and we did a lot of work with our departments, a lot of physical work in terms of walking around, getting impressions of what looked good practice, sharing that with other people. So that, a lot of work with, how do you greet students on the door? Because a lot of the boys have behavior, the behavior logs were higher for those boys than others.
Yeah.
So basically then they would, how do you greet them on the door? Forget about yesterday, that's irrelevant. Today is a new day. How do they feel when you say hello in the mornings? How do you feel in form time? So a lot of work was spent on that. And this is, loads of sort of work in that area, really, spending time. So the research was first, then I shared a lot of stuff with governors and then with staff. That was really important. They realized We need to move away from saying, right, boys are underachieving, what are we doing about the boys? No, boys are underachieving, what are we doing about our approach to our learning, to our lessons, to our outcomes? You know, how are we changing our expectations and our aspirations for these young people? So blow the ceiling off the aspirations. So you've got a boy who thinks mum and dad make a living out of dealing drugs, so I'm happy with that. That's fine. So I've got no aspirations because I'm just going to go into the family business, whatever that is. And we do genuinely have students in that situation. So, however, we do have a sort of a cohort of a dozen boys every year, as most schools do, who are the ringleaders, if you like. And I've written a self-esteem course called Picture of Potential. And I've worked specifically with those kids to help them unpick their self-esteem and to what are their goals in life, what do they want to get out of life. So that was the one specific thing we did with our sort of target group, if you like, the ringleaders, the leaders who would suck the other kids, the other young people down the wrong path, who might be at risk of not turning up to their exams, who might be at risk of leading others astray in the classroom and stuff. So I did work with them, and the evidence said that their self-esteem did rise in all cases on that course, because self-esteem is an awful lot of it for the boys particularly. So a boy might react differently. So they think, I'm not going to succeed in this subject. So what am I going to do? I'm going to cock about in all my lessons because I'm going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I may as well prove them right now by messing around, you know.
Also, they can become an expert messer around her. They can be the champion messer around her.
Absolutely. And that is their measure of success, perhaps. But I think it's also a sabotage moment because they think they're going to fail. So therefore they're scared of failure. So I may as well prove that I'm going to fail first, so that if I get kicked out of this class, then it's your fault, not my fault that I fail or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's a sabotage element. However, so therefore, but we really did spend a lot of time training staff in not looking at the problem, but looking at the bigger picture, right? What is, you know, each individual, how do you move them on? And we spent, we've spent a lot of the last few years looking at curriculum and assessment and how does that fit? Does our curriculum work? But all my research really took us away from boys' intervention to look at high expectations for all, high aspirations for all, classroom environments, contact with parents, making them realize they've got potential. These young people have potential to succeed. And that was it really. So yeah, we really did blow it out of the water in terms of our results last year, but I wouldn't take all the credit for that. I would say that some of it was just a fluke year, because we are looking at a gap again this year. A gap's come back in again in a negative way.
About how much of a gap do you have now, do you think?
Right. Let me just get some numbers up for you. 2019, I'm just giving some rough numbers. 2019, the boy to girl gap was over half a grade in terms of average point score. You know, the ability coming in there was a gap. 2020, similar. 2021, it reduced to basically 0. But then last year, boys outperformed girls by about a third of a grade. You know, amazing. This year, for the most recent assessment window, that's all I'll be able to do, obviously, because you haven't got the results yet.
Just while you're doing it, the average figures which we've been given is that the gap, I don't know what percent means, but it's 12% at entry to primary school.
Yeah.
5% at Key Stage 2 and 12% at Key Stage 4.
Wow.
That is, it appears that primary schools improve the situation, and on average, secondary schools make it worse.
Yeah. And
as a secondary school teacher myself, I'm sort of watching what happens to, you know, this bright-eyed and bushy-tailed bunch of year 7s come in, and by Christmas, there's some of the lower achievers wondering whether there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And then by year 10, there are those kids that you have in the small group because
there we go.
They don't disrupt anybody else.
So at present, it's looking like just 0.2 of a grade. That's quite a difference historically. So on the most recent mock results, it's about a fifth of a grade below in terms of average point score. Boys are, in some subjects it's wide, in some subjects it's much nearer, obviously. But
yes.
so yeah.
Do you think that the subjects that it's wider is kind of traditional preferences, like girls doing better in psychology?
Literacy-based subjects, generally the ones where the boys are underperforming more. It is still the case. That is still the case. And that fits in with what you said earlier on about the literacy back at primary, and it's feeding into that. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case.
Do you do a literacy intervention other than with the SEND in year 7?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we've got, in fact, we've just been talking about that at SLT for next year. We've got a new model, but we try different models every year. We've got basically 3 waves, and the bottom wave is our sort of 8 to 10. We've got quite a high number of highly needy EHCP. So those students will be taken out every morning for 2 hours to do maths and English intervention, so because they can't access the curriculum as a whole at the moment. Then the second wave is about 25 to 30 students who are in 4 groups, and they will have half an hour of literacy every morning for the first half hour of the day. And they'll be differentiated. They'll be in 4 groups. So the top group might go back into normal lessons after a term or half a term, even if their targets are hit. And then whereas the bottom group might spend the whole year doing half an hour's literacy intervention. They might not. They might be ready to go back to class, because obviously we need to get them reading properly before they can access anything else. So yeah, well, and something similar has been happening this year. We've just changed it a little bit, the structure a little bit. So yeah,
okay, you say 25. Is that out of what intake?
We've got about 210 per year group. So
okay.
we're talking just over 10%.
12%, yes.
Yeah, 10-15%. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So those with the SEN EHCP kids, you're talking about 15%, I would say, probably.
Right.
20%. Yeah.
Okay. And are you working with any other schools who are trying to address the same issue, or is it all your own initiative?
My project was all my own initiative. Rochdale are working. Rochdale have got a big pot of cash chucked at them because obviously they're an underachieving authority, and so we do have. I'm not sure of the detail because I'm not literacy, but there's a big pot of cash for next year to work together more.
Right.
Part of what's called a Pioneer Trust, which is a majority of the secondary schools and some of the primary schools in Rochdale that work together quite closely. So yeah, we do collaborate quite a lot on things.
Okay.
Literacy and oracy, the reading, writing, oracy program and things like that. So yeah, we do work collaboratively, but not in every respect by any stretch of imagination.
Right. Would you welcome some sort of linking of people who have succeeded in closing the gender gap?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to see that and work with them as well, because obviously we've had success, but I think there's far more to do, and I'd be interested to hear other ideas, because I've gone down one particular route, and I'm sure there are many other routes to go. Definitely, yeah.
Just this morning, I spoke to Dominic Burke at Balcarras in college in Cheltenham.
Right.
And they'd worked over a number of years and managed to close the gender gap. Very similar to you, except that they did do you did your work on self-esteem with a small group. They did it with all the boys and sort of set them a challenge that they were going to beat the girls this year and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good.
But what's coming across again and again is, at least to a significant extent, it's not to do with boys, it's to do with what does the person need.
Yeah.
And we were started off with this guy, Trevor Lloyd, who works with the pre-primary school kids. He said, it isn't really boys, it's with the underachieving kids, it's just that 80% of them are boys.
Mm-hmm.
And the girls have the same problem, the same attitude, but there are just fewer of them.
Yeah.
And then later on, so a lot of these lower boys who go on to be lower achievers in GCSE and a problem, they arrive at secondary school just not understanding enough words.
Mm-hmm.
They go to lessons and they hear teachers saying things which don't quite make sense, but seeing as what most teachers have ever said doesn't quite make sense, they don't see it as different.
Oh.
And so they're sitting there, and
Yeah.
then when they're young, they're more like their children and will please the teacher, sort of thing. But by the time they get to year 9, they start turning into
Exactly. And
young gentlemen that we all know well.
yeah, they'll communicate through behavior rather than communicating because they can't communicate any other way. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that is something that he brought up. He said that you can notice the behavior. The reason why they were acting up is because they couldn't moderate their emotions through language. That is,
We talk a lot about regulating emotions and stuff like that here. And that's dead right. And I think communication, behavior is just another form of communication.
Yeah.
And a lot of these young people, particularly got low self-esteem, have got early life trauma or various ACEs, as we call it, will communicate in a way that is not helpful for a classroom environment. And it's about saying, okay, that's the behavior is not acceptable, but what are they telling us? What's going on here? Is it an undiagnosed need? Is it that mum and dad are beating them up every morning, or is it that they just can't read or they can't access the curriculum? What is it they're trying to tell us? And I think schools are having to become more aware of this and far more trauma informed. And I think that's really, really important. And we're spending our whole sort of focus next year around to say, right, we're looking at relationship. That's what we're looking at as our whole school, relationships. How do you relate to these young people? What do we need to work on in terms of our parents, teacher, child relationships? How do we improve those? So that, because if those are sorted, those are improved, then an awful lot of stuff will follow. It doesn't fix everything, but it goes a big way to fixing a lot of issues that schools have with your relationships. Communication is a massive issue, and schools need to improve that. I mean, I've just been taught, because I'm assistant head attached to year 7. So for next year's year 7, we've got transition evening this evening, which is why I'm still in work. So the parents are coming in at 6 o'clock. So we'll be telling them about a little course that I put together, a parenting course fundamentally, to help young people, to help parents of the young people who might be harder to reach and harder to engage with. So that, we will be seeing them every half term in the building, face to face, build relationships with these challenging families, so that we can, build relationships with them, invite specific ones in. Some will want to come as well. And that means that's important for parents to know that your kid is amazing. Yes, they might communicate with me through poor behavior occasionally, but they're incredible. And that's a massive thing that's been missed out because of the pandemic. And rebuilding and re-establishing these relationships is challenging. And the family, that dynamic there has a massive impact on the dynamic in school that we're left to pick up day to day. Massive.
Do you think that teachers tend to be scared of the parents of badly behaved pupils?
Yes, some teachers are. There's no doubt about it. Some teachers will avoid that confrontation, will find that confrontation challenging,
or not know how to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, perhaps, and that's part of what our training will be next year. One, about how do you de-escalate a situation with a student. I'm not going to lie, I've had situations in the past where a teacher said I've been assaulted, and they talk you through a situation where kids lost the plot, and they get to a point in the conversation and they said, and I was standing in the way of the door. I think, okay, so you weren't assaulted, you were blocking that young person's exit. They were trying to leave a situation where they had lost the plot, where they had were totally dysregulated and were in crisis, and you blocked their path to an open door. So I'm sorry, you weren't assaulted, you were in their way. So we've lots of training to staff about how to deal with a young person who's dysregulated, how to stop them getting that curve, reaching the crisis. How do we stop it down there? But if they do get to crisis, how do we bring them back down again? We allow them to leave, fight or flight, blah, blah, blah. But the same with parents. Some parents come in having had a call or an email, they'll come into reception and they'll absolutely be on the ceiling. So how does a member of staff de-escalate that situation? Or when they phone to give some information to a parent, how do you phrase that conversation so that that parent is supportive rather than gets their back up? How is our communication there? Is it the systems you use? Like we've got Synergy, which sends out automatic texts for behavior reports and detentions and stuff like that, which is very useful for most families, not for some if they're getting 4 or 5 a day. You know, so they'll be getting stressed by that, and that might cause an issue of relationship. It might not, but it is how we phrase that. So yeah, you're right. Some staff find that difficult, and we need to help, especially young staff. You know, if you're a 22-year-old first-time teacher coming to move into Middleton, however expert you are in a classroom, you're not ready for a 45-year-old burly bloke to shout and swear at you on the phone about giving your son a detention. You know, are you? You're not ready for that, and nor should you be, by the way. But how?
Yeah, I don't think I was ready. I took up teaching when I was 50, and nobody trained me in that. If you know what I mean.
No.
I hadn't, although I'd done lots of different interesting things, I hadn't had to deal with stroppy parent before.
Exactly.
But I mean, I'm sure everybody does the same thing. Eventually, you discover the first thing to do is say something positive, and then you say, "But I've called you in because, and I need your help." But anyway,
you know,
I'm meant to be finding out what you know. Can you tell me? Do you think? Some people say that boys benefit from a more disciplined environment, and do you think that you have done that, or is it not been an issue for you?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say we've done that. I think yes, boys need, but all students need clear boundaries about what's stepping over. But again, it's about individuals. So you've got to look at every situation as an individual, and I think boys. No, it's not just boys. We've got the same situations. You know, we have an inclusion room like most schools. If you go up the behaviour ladder, so they've got detentions. They don't turn up to the detention. They mess around the detention. Then they have to go out of circulation for a day before they get suspended or whatever. It's equal number of boys and girls who sit there and say, "Not doing it. No, I'm not doing it." It's similar. There's no disparity there. I wouldn't say there's any difference. It's about young people who struggle. It's about young people who struggle with that decision. So I don't think there's. But so yeah, clear boundaries is important. But for all, again, I don't think we need to move away from gender specific.
So actually, if you want to help the boys, you have to create the discipline for them that the girls don't necessarily need.
Yeah.
But that would mean providing the discipline just for the boys. It's just that it would apply more.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah.
But you haven't made a big thing out of discipline. Maybe you've got a good enough discipline.
I think we've got a good behaviour policy anyhow. The structure's there. We're always reviewing it. I think it is there, but we have a very much a restorative approach to behaviour. So it is really important that if it's a situation between a teacher and a student in a classroom, that they have an opportunity to restore that relationship, whether it's literally a 2-minute conversation at the start of the next lesson, in the past, mate, have a good lesson, or something that needs facilitating by, we've got staff like myself who are trained to facilitate those conversations. If it's a more ongoing issue, staff to students, you know, we'll get them together in the room and I'll facilitate a conversation to enable a restorative structure, you know, a bit of restorative justice. So yeah.
You have a kind of system whereby, I mean, normally, you know, pupil does something, teacher doesn't think it's appropriate, they tell them off, and first a lot of them just behave immediately. Then you get the sort of second level, you put them outside the room for 3 or 4 minutes and you speak to them, and then that deals with another huge percentage. And then you've got the little percentage where as a teacher you feel that you need some help. Do you have a process in place?
We do. We've got a very clear process. So we've got, I don't necessarily like the letters because it's consequence. I'm not sure I like consequence, but anyhow, we do that. So C1, it would be your verbal warning, and it is up to a teacher whether that's 1 or 3 verbal warnings. It doesn't really matter. You've got your classroom, you know. And then if they still can you know, still carrying on, you would then issue a C2, which is an after school detention, a 40-minute detention. We have a centralized system so everybody gets the same then. However, if that continues, we have every member of SLT or middle leaders are on call every lesson. So and we have a buddy system classroom as well. So if it's my maths lesson and someone's prattling about, I'll look at my timetable and find the buddy room. So they're still misbehaving, they're still disrupting the learning. They'll be taken by that person on call to the buddy classroom.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
It's at the back of the sixth form lesson that's going on at the same time, or whatever. If that fails, then they will be taken for the rest of the lesson to inclusion, just for the rest of that lesson. So there's a very clear pathway, yeah, and it's clear as daylight, to be honest, what happens if that, and so on and so forth, you know.
Experience of a lot of teachers is don't bother calling SLT, because they'll give them a good letting off. They'll be back in your classroom in 5 minutes and nothing will happen. You seem to have done what the other successful people have done, and that is create a culture in which the individual teacher feels supported.
I would say we try to do that. Does every individual teacher feel supported every day? Of course they don't.
No.
But yes, the culture is there, 100%. The culture is there to do that, to try and do that. Absolutely.